Many years ago, in the busy port of Antwerp, in the Low Countries, when women wore long dresses and men carried swords and put feathers in their hats, there lived a man named Peter Coke van Alst. He was an artist of many talents, creating remarkable drawings and panel paintings. Other artists and craftsmen used his fine and clever drawings and paintings to create tapestries, stained-glass windows, prints, and decorative objects. His reputation was grand. He was highly praised by his fellow artists and sought out by wealthy patrons and royalty from England, France, and Spain. High-quality, expensive tapestries were commissioned and sold throughout Europe, covering the walls of palaces and abbeys in a splendor of colors, silver and gold. Peter Coke van Alst executed exquisitely detailed preparatory drawings, and these he enlarged to tapestry-size cartoons. Weavers used these cartoons to create huge and sumptuous tapestries with the most expensive wool, silk, gold, and silver thread. Some tapestries were so detailed and fine, but so monumental in their size, that it could take years to finish and deliver them to the rich patrons who had ordered them. Peter Coke van Alst lived in Antwerp, but he also worked in Brussels. Indeed, at that time, 1 of every 3 persons in Brussels was involved in the production of tapestries, from the designer to the cartoon painters, from the thread spinner to the dyer, from the master weaver to journeyman weavers, and the many apprentices, all of whom were bound by the rules of the guilds. Peter Coke van Alst also traveled to distant countries. He attempted to develop a business in the Ottoman world and went to the great capital Constantinople in Turkey, returning home by way of Italy. He brought back detailed drawings, and these inspired him and other artists to render landscape and buildings following the custom and fashion of faraway countries. In addition to his collaborations to produce different kinds of works of art, Peter Koch van Aalst also translated and published architectural treatises from Italian and Latin to Dutch, French, and German. Sometimes he added his own work to the book. His translations helped in spreading Italian art theory to the Low Countries and influenced Netherlandish architecture. But Peter Koch van Aalst's travels were not his only source of inspiration. Like many Renaissance artists, sculptors, painters, and writers alike, he read the Metamorphoses, a narrative poem by the Roman poet Ovid. Over 15 books, Ovid narrated the history of the gods and deities, among them Vertumnus, god of the seasons, and Pomona, goddess of fruit trees and gardens. In his studio, Peter Koch van Aalst fell asleep and dreamt. He dreamt of the design he would create to retell the story of Vertumnus and Pomona in his own way. Once, when the kings of the Silvian house reigned over the Latin people, there lived a nymph named Pomona. She never went near the springs, or lakes, or rivers, nor near the wild woods. No, she cared only for places where trees grew, especially those laden with fruits. She constantly carried a curved pruning knife to take care of the trees. With her knife, she would cut back the luxuriant growth and lop off branches that spread out here and there. She would make a cut in a tree and graft into it a twig from another tree, and would rejoice at the sight of one tree bearing two kinds of fruit. Sometimes she would train a vine to grow along an elm tree. All day long she worked where fruits grew, loosening the earth round the roots of some of the trees, watering them, and destroying insects that settled upon their leaves. This was her love and her passion, and she desired nothing else. Pomona was lithe and robust, and grew to be as handsome as the apples upon her trees. Still, fearing rude behavior from the satyrs, Pan, Silvanus, and Priapus, she enclosed herself in her orchard. She built a wall around her trees and put up a gate, and she would not go outside the gate, very careful to let no one who might want to be her lover pass through it. Attracted by Pomona's beauty, many suitors attempted to enter her garden and seduce her. But she never let them in. All year long, she stayed in her garden, adjusting her gardening tasks to the season. One winter day, While Pomona was taking care of her potted citrus trees, young Vertumnus, god of season and changes, came to her garden entrance. When he saw Pomona through the gate, Vertumnus immediately fell in love with her. He tried to talk to her, but as young and handsome as he was no more successful than any of the other suitors. The nymph did not let him come in and turned her back to him. Vertumnus decided to take his chances at seducing Pomona. Using his gift for an ability to change, he tried to enter her garden disguised as a farmer. As spring was approaching, he thought, with fresh grass on his head and a fork in his hand, he might seem to have been tossing the new-mown grass. But Pomona recognized him right away and stopped him even before he reached the gate. Some days later, seeing the nymph picking up fruits in the company of her dogs, Vertumnus thought of another disguise. If he was a shepherd, maybe she would let him in. With his hat and his staff in one hand, Vertumnus was sure Pomona would think he had left his herd guarded by his dogs in the fields. But the nymph recognized him again at once, and did not let him in. She went back to her trees and ignored Vertumnus. Now it was full summer, time to reap the wheat and barley. Vertumnus arrived dressed as a harvester, carrying a huge armful of ripe golden wheat and wearing a straw hat. He approached the gate. Half hidden by the wheat, he was able, at least, to come a bit closer and gaze at Pomona's beauty. But Pomona once again recognized him and sent him away. Since no disguise seemed good enough, Vertumnus now had to change his plan. If the nymph's love were only for fruit trees, then he too would have to show an interest in fruit trees. So, as apple season arrived, he came dressed as a fruit picker. Bearing a ladder upon his shoulder and a clipper in his belt, he passed the gate as if he were ready to climb to where the fruits were growing. As he came closer, Pomona stopped him and sent him out promptly. With fall came the grape-picking season, and a perfect disguise for Vertumnus. He would be a vintner. With his pruning knife in his hand, he offered his service to pick the grapes and make wine. But Pomona refused his help. She had already plenty of children who had come to help in the garden, and she did not need any men. Day after day, season after season, Vertumnus had failed to enter the garden and seduce Pomona. He was desperate. Maybe if he could impress Pomona, she would accept him. Dressed as a glorious soldier in his shiny armor and a sword in his strong hand, he presented himself at the gate. But once again, Pomona rebuked him, and he left, heartbroken. As a last resort, and because none of his garden outfits nor his splendor had succeeded in gaining him admittance to Pomona's garden, Vertumnus came dressed as a peaceful and innocent fisherman. Pomona had no interest for this either. She barely looked at him, and for the 8th time she sent him away, like all the other suitors. One day, Pomona was resting under her pergola when she saw outside her gate a bent old woman with a scarf covering her head and half of her face. Pomona kindly invited the woman inside and offered her a seat in the shade to rest. She then gave her one of her apples. "How beautifully your garden is kept," said the old woman. "I've never seen such lovely trees, and your fruits are so bright and refreshing. Do you live here alone, my dear?" Pomona nodded. "How sad," said the old woman. "A beautiful, graceful, and charming young lady, living alone and unwed." "I don't need any lover here," said Pomona. The old woman pointed at the vine climbing on the elm tree and said, "Look at that elm tree. If it stood unmated to the vine, it would have no value except for its timber. And the vine that grows there, if there's no elm tree for it to grow upon, it would spread wasted upon the ground, flat and unflourishing. So you see what good can come of mating two beings, the vine and the elm tree? But you, my dear, refuse to be mated, refuse to be wed, refuse even to know one who might be a sweetheart for you. Listen, let an old woman like me make a match for you." Pomona was surprised, but did not say anything. The old woman continued, "Be wise and choose Vertumnus. I know him. He is a good man, not like the other suitors. Like you, he lives on his own. He does not love each latest girl he's seen. In fact, you will be his first love and his last. He is young and blessed with natural charm, and, also like you, he cherishes apples and apple trees." As the old woman kept talking about Vertumnus, little by little she convinced Pomona that Vertumnus was the perfect choice. And as a last argument, the old woman added, "And remember, my dear, the story of Anaxarete, who constantly rejected her suitor Iphis. The gods turned her into a statue to avenge the poor lover. Fear the vengeful gods. Stop rejecting Vertumnus." And with one quick movement, the old woman removed the scarf covering her head, and there, in the glowing sun, under the disguise of the old woman, Vertumnus appeared in the splendor of his youth. Pomona stood up, more surprised than afraid, but, captivated by the young god and convinced by his discourse, she sat back down with him, under the vine. They talked all day long. When night came, and the first star appeared in the sky, Pomona had fallen in love with Vertumnus, and promised to wed him before the next season. Peter Koch van Alst woke up in his workshop. Full of ideas, he took his brush and started to work on his project. He had in mind to create a set of tapestries to retell the story of Vertumnus and Pomona. Later, he will design a set of 9 tapestries. The set will be so popular that several sumptuous editions of it will be made to ornament the walls of royal palaces in Spain and France and England. The luxurious garden settings with the pergolas that Peter Koch van Alst designed will go on to inspire many generations of weavers and artists of all sorts.